Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. This is my lecture for my Philosophy of Mind course, and it's on David Chalmers's philosophical zombie argument. Zombie arguments have played a big role in the last part of the 20th century in philosophy of mind. You're going to be surprised about the results here. The idea is that first, the step is that we conceive or imagine or picture a zombie twin of a normal human. So what does that mean? Well, a zombie twin is, to use Chalmers's words, a creature who is molecule for molecule identical to me and identical in all the low-level properties postulated by a completed physics, but he lacks conscious experience entirely. So this is not a rotting cannibalistic zombie like you see in the movies. This is a person that looks and talks and acts and has physical properties, all the same physical chemical properties as you, but there's no experience on the inside. There's no phenomenal consciousness. There's no subjective what it's like to feel something on the inside. It's dark. The lights are out inside. It doesn't look like the lights are out, but the person has no subjective experience on the inside. And the only question here at this first stage in the argument is whether or not you can imagine such a thing. So Chalmers says to fix our ideas, we can imagine that right now I am gazing out the window, experiencing some nice green sensations from seeing the trees outside, having pleasant taste experiences through munching on a chocolate bar, and feeling a dull aching sensation in my right shoulder. So that's a normal human who's having phenomenological experiences on the inside. But Chalmers' zombie twin is physically identical to him, and we may as well suppose that he is embedded in an identical environment. So imagine he's in the very same sort of environment around him. He will certainly be identical to me functionally. He will be processing the same sort of information, reacting in a similar way to inputs, with his internal configurations being modified appropriately and with indistinguishable behavior resulting. So the idea is, can you picture a walking, talking, behaving human that has all the same sorts of features that a normal human does, a human that you attribute subjective consciousness to? This person can talk about what they're going through. They can act like they're eating a chocolate bar. They can report on what's going on. They'll say and do all the same sorts of things. But actually, there's nothing that it feels on the inside. It doesn't have any sensation or feelings on the inside. Chalmers says the zombie will even be conscious in the functional senses described earlier. He will be awake, able to report the contents of his internal states, able to focus his attention on various places, and so on. So were I to ask the zombie, what are you thinking about right now? The zombie will say, well, I'm thinking about zombie arguments. So from the outside, it looks and talks, acts just like a regular human, but it doesn't actually have any feels on the inside. And the only question at this point is just whether or not you can imagine such a thing. It's just that none of this functioning will be accompanied, says Chalmers, by any real conscious experience. There will be no phenomenal feel. There's nothing it's like to be a zombie. So can you imagine something like that? From the outside, the David Chalmers who has feelings is indistinguishable from the David Chalmers that's a zombie. So Chalmers maintains that this scenario, the one we've just described, is conceptually coherent. That's going to make a lot of difference later, but for right now, his idea is that my describing it and you going through this process of imagining or picturing it in your head is enough to establish that it's conceptually coherent. It's unlikely that zombies are naturally possible, says Chalmers. So I'll say something more about natural possibility in a minute, but to say that something's naturally impossible just means that it's ruled out by natural laws. So he's allowing that this might be ruled out by our natural laws, but physics might prevent something like this from happening. Nevertheless, it's still conceptually coherent and it's still something we can picture or something that's logically consistent from our imagining it. So in the real world, the world we live in, the world with our physics, it's likely that any replica of me would be conscious. Were you to put all the right physical systems in place and have them all functioning the way they do, the way our bodies do, those things, have subjective consciousness. So you'd have to change something about physics, or something would be, you have to be in a different set of natural laws or something else, some other world. But we can picture it, we can imagine it. So Chalmers says the question is whether the notion of a zombie is conceptually coherent. The mere intelligibility of the notion is enough to establish the conclusion. So this is one of these really powerful philosophical arguments where just being able to think of it or just being able to picture it, that's enough to establish the conclusion. And the conclusion here, of course, is that Chalmers is going to argue that physicalism is false, that consciousness is not a physical phenomena. Okay, so it's a really powerful conclusion to follow from just the mere intelligibility or the mere sort of picturability of this thing in our minds, like we just did. Okay, so how do we know that this scenario, that the zombie hypothesis, is conceptually coherent? Chalmers says it's just obvious. What does that mean? Well, how do you argue for the logical possibility of something? So there's a bunch of different concepts, a bunch of different terms that get thrown around here. I'm going to run some of them together just for the sake of simplicity. In a little bit, I'm going to separate them. But for right now, I'm going to kind of switch back and forth from logical possibility to conceivability, and we'll talk about metaphysical necessity and natural necessity in a minute. There's a lot of stuff going on, but let's just lift this and talk about it kind of sloppily to start. So how do you argue for the logical possibility of some scenario or some statement X? Like take a mile-high unicycle. That seems like it's logically possible. It certainly seems like it's conceptually coherent. Now, it might be impossible to build a mile-high unicycle. It might be that our materials won't allow us to make such a thing, although surely they would. I guess it'd be hard to ride one. But we could actually build one, and it certainly seems like it's logically possible. Is the notion itself conceptually coherent? It seems obvious that it is. There's nothing in the consideration of the notion that is explicitly logically contradictory. It seems quite clear that there's no hidden contradiction lurking in the description, says Chalmers. And that's the description of the zombie possibility. So with something that's explicitly logically contradictory, for instance, like take a married bachelor. Okay, so that's going to be my paradigm example of something that's logically impossible. It's not something that's conceptually coherent. It's not something that you can form a picture of in your head. Somebody might resist on this, but look, to be a bachelor is to be an unmarried adult human male. So to be a married bachelor is to be a married unmarried thing. So that's an explicitly contradictory state of affairs. What you can do is you can picture, or you can imagine, or you can, conceive of a man who's married, or you can conceive of a man who's not married, but you can't conceive of a man who's both married and unmarried any more than you can conceive of a square circle. I mean, what I've got here in the picture is a square or a circle, but you can't conceive of something that's both. Those are logically mutually exclusive descriptions. Something can't both have both properties. So in this case, something like I can picture or form an idea of X in my head is being taken as an indicator that X is a logically possible state of affairs. So what Chalmers has done is he's saying, well, I can form or picture this zombie possibility in my head, and that is what I'm using now as an indicator of its logical possibility. Now, that turns out to be contentious. Later, people like Dan Dennett are going to argue and say that actually you're not imagining what you think you're imagining, so you didn't really get off the ground here. But for now, let's just allow Chalmers' argument, and you'll see how this pans out. Okay, so it's come to be known, at least Chalmers calls it, the zombie intuition. The zombie situation just described appears to be coherent. I can discern no contradiction in the description. It's a brute intuition, and he says almost everyone is capable of conceiving of this possibility. You might dig in about this and think about it more later. At the first pass, it sure seems like we just conceived of it. What Dennett's going to press back on, and some of the other authors in the literature in the background here, is going to say, well, you feel like, or you think you've done something that amounts to conceiving of it, but actually there's contradictions buried or sort of lurking deep in there that you can't really suss out just by this sort of simple picturing activity. But for Chalmers' sake, he thinks you've done it, and that's good enough. You can picture your zombie twin in a way that you can't conceive of or picture a married bachelor, and that's enough to separate these two logically, and that's where he's going to drive the wedge in between and undermine physicalism. So in general, he says now, because we just pulled this off, is that a certain burden of proof lies on those who'd claim that a given description is logically impossible. So if you're going to deny that you've done this thing, then now you're the one who's got to explain, the burden of proof is on you to explain how it is that you're not able to picture this, or why is it logically impossible, or where is the contradiction? Exactly where is the married-unmarried part of the zombie twin scenario that we just described? If no reasonable analysis of the terms in question points to a contradiction, or even makes the existence of a contradiction plausible, then there's a natural assumption in favor of logical possibility. And that's what gets Chalmers off the ground here. So he says that since this scenario is conceivable, hence it's logically possible, then that means that there is no conceptual entailment from the biochemistry of the brain to the phenomena of consciousness. That is, since I can separate those two in my mind in the way I can't separate unmarried from bachelor, now we've got a problem, because that means that we're conceiving of the biochemistry of brains on one side, and there's no way to entail or drive this logical connection to phenomenal consciousness on the inside, the subjective feel part. So that's enough, says Chalmers, to establish, therefore consciousness fails to logically supervene on the physical. Consciousness is something over and above the physical. Consciousness is something that's not explained by the physical facts. So the zombie argument then boils down to this nice, clean 4-line argument. A philosophical zombie is conceivable. That's the first thing we did. And if a philosophical zombie is conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible. And if it's metaphysically possible, then consciousness is not physical. And therefore, consciousness is not physical because of this failure of entailment. We saw an argument a little bit like this when we did Nagel's "What's it like to be a bat?" argument, and I'm going to recast the form of the argument from Nagel here to match onto the way Chalmers is given an argument. It seems like he's given an argument sort of this sort. Given an alleged physical explanation E of some phenomena P, if it is logically possible for E to obtain and P to not occur, which is what we did by conceiving of one without the other, then E does not explain P. Seems to be Chalmers's presumption, and we just did it. It is logically possible for a reductive explanation of mind to obtain, that is of your brain to obtain, and mental phenomena not occur, since we can coherently conceive or imagine one without the other, since we conceived of the zombie possibility. So that shows that alleged physical explanations of consciousness do not explain. Okay, so there's a huge literature here and a very detailed technical set of debates in the philosophy journals. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a kind of simple caricature version of an objection to Chalmers. So I'm going to confess straight up that this objection sort of makes it's not quite a straw man objection. That is, it's not quite an objection that just makes his position into a straw man position, but it's not exactly steel manning his position either. It's not giving him the absolute most charity benefit of the doubt. But trust me, you don't want us to go into this sort of advanced debate about the nature of logical necessity. It gets really technical and requires a whole bunch of analysis. So I'm going to give you kind of the simpler version of it, and give you a hint about where the physicalist response, at least one of them or two of them, have come back in reaction to the zombie argument. So I'll pitch it this way. So here's a problem. Do physical explanations logically necessitate their effects? That seems to be the presumption that Chalmers is operating on. He seems to be suggesting that physical accounts have to logically necessitate their effects the way that conceiving of a bachelor logically necessitates that the thing you're imagining is unmarried. And the objection here runs this way. Material explanations do not have the force of logical necessity behind them. So to point out that this physical explanation doesn't logically necessitate or logically rule out the zombie example doesn't undermine physicalism. That's the way this objection goes. That is, take all of our physical explanations of all phenomena, other things that we know for a fact they're just physical phenomena, like heat, chemistry, physics, biology, whatever. It's logically possible that I might add an acid to a base and it wouldn't blow up, or it's logically possible that E does not equal mc squared, but it doesn't follow as a result that acids mixed with bases do not explode, or that E does not equal mc squared. So here's what I'm getting at. Go to a paradigmatic physical case where we have a physical phenomena, where a physical cause brings about a physical effect, and we have a laws of nature description that predicts the outcome, like we do with in chemistry, where we know to a sort of certainty that if you mix an acid with a base, you'll get an explosion. That's what happens when you put baking soda in vinegar, when you're a kid or when you're in your 8th grade science class. Or we get a complicated argument from Einstein that makes him famous that for the equation that E equals mc squared. None of those physical explanations or physical accounts of phenomena are logically necessary. That is, the kind of knowledge that we are uncovering or that we're discovering when we inquire into the physical world is not logical necessity. It's not like we're learning about bachelors, that they're unmarried when we learn that acids mixed with bases blow up. But Chalmers seems to be demanding that the only sorts of explanations that can suffice are ones that logically necessitate their outcomes. So he set the bar really super high for an explanation, and then when physicalism fails to explain phenomenal consciousness by this high bar, then he announces that physicalism fails. But it's only by setting the bar so high that nothing could satisfy the condition that he's imposed on it. So I'd maintain that the conception of these scenarios, that is, I mix an acid to a base and it doesn't blow up, or I imagine that E doesn't equal mc squared. Those are intelligible. They're conceptually coherent, at least in the sense that the philosophical zombie is. But as a result, we don't conclude that those things haven't been explained by science. Okay, so let me sort of unpack that and build onto it. So take some physical laws like E equals mc squared, or we know that at least on the surface of the Earth, that G equals 9.8 meters per second squared. That's a particular instance of the universal law of gravitation that I've got on the right-hand side of the screen there. We also know that the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, that law helps me make predictions about what's going to happen if I put a lid on a pot of water on the stove and turn the heat up. So those are laws that we recognize that operate, and they describe all of these phenomena in the world, but it's also conceivable and therefore logically possible by this argument that the speed of light was 100 miles an hour. Imagine that you get your car up to 100 miles an hour, and then when you gun it and cross over from 100 to 101 miles per hour, that a bystander standing there watching your car would just vanish from sight because you just exceeded the speed of light, and we can no longer use light to bounce off of you to see where you were. Did you just picture that? Did you just conceive of that? Did you just form a coherent picture of that in your head? It seems like you did. I'd maintain you did just as much as you can imagine a mile-high unicycle, or imagine that G is something else, or imagine that PV equals nRT plus 3, or some other kind of, imagine some other physical law. That is, we can imagine them not being true without contradiction. Logical impossibilities, by contrast, are inconceivable. Try to conceive of a married bachelor, and I maintain, and Chalmers would agree, that you can't. Okay, so Chalmers says that we can form a coherent thought of a philosophical zombie, and that entails that is therefore logically possible, and then that moves us on to this point that physicalism fails. But it looks like if that's going to make physicalism about mental phenomena fail, then that's going to make all physical explanations fail about everything. That's what I'm hinting at. So here's another example. Here's a Homer Simpson fantasy from The Simpsons. He's imagining the world raining donuts. Such a thing is certainly logically possible. It's certainly conceivable. You can sure form a picture of it. In fact, you're watching an animation of it happening right now. You're looking at a cartoon of it raining donuts. So clearly that's a logical possibility in a way that I can't draw a cartoon of a married bachelor. If you like, I mean, there's a good test for logical possibility. Can we draw a cartoon of it? I can draw a cartoon of Superman flying who's violating the laws of physics. I can draw a cartoon of it raining donuts that's violating the laws of physics, but I can't draw a cartoon of 2 + 2 = 5 or a square triangle or a married bachelor. That's the limits on conceivability in that kind of case. Okay, so what kind of necessity should we be considering here in this kind of case? Logical necessity, I've said, is a case where any proposition whose opposite implies a logical contradiction, it could not be false. So all bachelors are unmarried, squares have 4 sides. The opposites of those claims create logical contradictions. So those are logical necessities. A logical possibility is any state of affairs that's not logically contradictory. So we've imagined Superman flying or it's raining donuts as logical possibilities. And Chalmers seems to be asserting that since the zombie scenario is conceivable, hence it's logically possible, then that means that there's no conceptual entailment from the biochemistry of the brain to the phenomena of consciousness. And I think we might even grant, I mean, there's a family of objections here, as I've suggested, like from Dan Dennett, who disagree with the first premise. So the first premise was that philosophical zombies are conceivable, or we can imagine them. And some people protest there. Dennett has argued that, in fact, you're not imagining what you think you're imagining when you go through this little procedure. What we're complaining about is the second or third premise. We're complaining about whether or not that conceivability entails that the explanation fails. So Chalmers has taken this case to mean that since it's possible, then there's no conceptual entailment, and since there's no conceptual entailment from biochemistry to the phenomena of consciousness, then physicalism fails. That is, consciousness fails to logically supervene on the physical. And I'm suggesting that you never get conceptual entailment from biochemistry to anything, or from physics to anything, or from chemistry to anything, any prior set of conditions to some posterior effects. You never get logical entailment. So to point that out here about physicalist accounts of consciousness doesn't amount to an objection, not the objection that he thinks it does. But according to this objection, since no physical explanations logically necessitate their outcomes, then there are no physical accounts that explain any phenomena. So he's sort of thrown out the baby with the bathwater. He's thrown out physics and chemistry and geology, and all of the sciences now collapse or fail for the same reason, since he set the bar so high. Okay, so are there other kinds of necessity? You might remember us talking about some of these with Nagel. We do have a conception of nomological necessity. That is, let's say a word here about natural possibility and necessity. The laws of nature, like the universal law of gravitation, which we've already talked about, those determine or put boundaries on what's naturally possible. So we'd say, for instance, that it's not naturally possible for an unaided human body to fly. That is, your musculature, your bone structure, and the other physiological traits of the human body would prevent you from just leaping off a building and flapping your arms and flying. That is, so in the Superman case, that's not an unaided normal human body that's flying. Superman's flying is not naturally possible. You can't just have a human do that. However, we can draw a picture of it and we can imagine it, and it's logically possible. That's what makes for good comic books, after all. So we do think, however, it's naturally possible to cure cancer. We don't have it yet, but we think it's out there. We think it's within the boundaries of physics and chemistry as we understand it. So the laws of nature, which are different from the laws of logic, they could have been different without logical contradiction. We could be in a different universe that has different laws of nature, and in that world, you'd have a different set of nomological necessities or nomological constraints on what things are physically possible and what things are not. So maybe Chalmers has got something like that in mind. Imagine the periodic table could have been different, gravity could have attracted at a different rate, and so on. If one of those different sets of natural laws were in place in our world, then the range of what events that are naturally possible would be different than the range of events we find possible in our world. Okay, so maybe he's got that in mind. Maybe he means X as a nomological necessity means that given the laws of nature, X cannot fail to happen. It has to happen. So if you step off a 10-story building, you will fall to the ground. All other conditions, all other circumstances being kept the same. If you mix an acid with a base, it will create a severe exothermic reaction. That's a nomological necessity. It'll blow up. The laws of logic don't necessitate those events, but the laws of physics do. Floating off of the building creates no logical contradiction. So maybe Chalmers, maybe that's what's going on here. Chalmers says that conceiving of a zombie shows that there's no conceptual entailment between biochemistry and consciousness. And if there's no conceptual entailment, then the physical explanation fails. But that's weird, right? Do physical explanations ever preclude being able to conceive of a different correlate to the physical facts? So take the case where we know about gravity, and we know about the density of air and the density of a human body, and we know that if the distance from the top of a 10-story building to the ground is 100 feet, we've got a lot of physical facts there that you plug them into the equations, and we know to a nomological necessity that you're going to fall to the ground. Does that physical explanation, or does that nomological necessity, does that rule out your ability to conceive of a different state of affairs? Could you imagine something else happening? And that's just bizarre, right? Because we imagine, we picture those sorts of scenarios in really intimate detail really often, right? There's this famous scene in The Matrix where Neo works up his courage and leaps off the edge of a building and manages to jump from the top of one building to another that's like half a mile away, right? The physical laws would rule that out, but we just conceived of it. We just pictured it. We just imagined it. Does that rule out physics? No, it doesn't rule out physics. It's just something we imagined, right? That's what every superhero movie you've ever watched is based on, is superheroes doing things that are above and beyond the sort of normal range of physics. Okay, so let's say another word here about conceivability and physical explanations, just to sort of, round out the point and make it really clear. I can conceive, for instance, another example of all the physical facts about my lawnmower and combustion engines being the same, but my mower turns into a bird and flies away instead of starting when I pull the cord. Right? That's conceivable. You just imagined it, just like you imagined a mile-high unicycle. I can conceive of putting an ordinary lit match to a stick of regular dynamite and it turns into a bouquet of flowers, right? That's like a magic show. You could picture something like that. I can conceive of putting the heat on high under my pot of water on the stove, and when it reaches 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the pot and the water turn to ice instead of start boiling. I can conceive of that, right? Did I just disprove the physical explanations for combustion engines, for dynamite, and for boiling water? I don't think so, right? You can picture all those things, but it didn't change the physical facts or the physical laws about those at all. So here's the argument. Here's what I'm getting at. Here's Chalmers' first argument. A philosophical zombie is conceivable, he said. And if they're conceivable, then philosophical zombies are metaphysically possible. And if they're metaphysically possible, then consciousness is non-physical. So it follows that consciousness is non-physical. Now, I said earlier that I was fudging some of the details about the literature and the discussions in the background. You'll notice that I've now stuck in, or I've followed Chalmers and used the term metaphysically possible in this sentence. And this is that place where I'm fudging, because I've actually talked now about logical necessity and nomological necessity, but I haven't said much about metaphysical possibility and metaphysical necessity. You don't want me to. That's a whole nother lecture. It's a whole nother hour or two to talk about, and it gets us into a bunch of technical worries. But suffice it for our purposes now that the objection I've offered still can be made against that account of metaphysical possibility too. That is, my short point is to say that physical explanations never render their outputs as metaphysically necessary either. Lawnmowers don't metaphysically, it's not metaphysically necessary that lawnmowers start as a result of pulling the cord. So the objection that I've offered here to consider, this is the main one, it's in addition to Dennett's objection about premise 1, is that if conceiving of some contra-nomological scenario disproves a physical explanation, then no physical explanation or account of any physical phenomena succeeds as an explanation. But physical accounts of physical phenomena do explain. That is, I think, that when we give a theory of combustion engines, or we give a theory of chemistry, or we give a theory of physics, and then we make a prediction about somebody falling off a building, we are explaining that phenomena. So physical explanations succeed even though they don't preclude conceiving of these contra-nomological scenarios. So I've maintained, or at least the objection that I've been summarizing for our purposes, is that therefore conceiving of contra-nomological scenarios does not disprove a physical explanation, so that undercuts Chalmers's move in premise 2 or premise 3, and that means that physicalism remains plausible or remains open as a possibility for explaining phenomenal consciousness.